Hey everybody. Hey, thanks for joining me today. Today we're actually talking a little bit about hippies, and yeah, that's kind of why I'm dressed this way. Hippies actually were a cultural phenomenon that happened in the middle to the late 1960s in the United States. And the hippies, you probably heard the term, he's a hippie. Yeah, it's just he doesn't really care. And I guess you could say there's a little truth to that. The hippie generation, they were young people. They were high school age kids and college age kids. They were just becoming young adults around 1965 to say 1970. And the one thing that the hippies all believed in was peace and love and nonviolence. And why did they become hippies? Well, hippies were a unique brand. They were kids that looked back at their mom and dad's generation and said, you can have all that materialism. You can have all those nice, fine things. We want to get back to nature. We want to get back to living a simpler, cleaner lifestyle. Kind of like the Amish, I guess, but in tie-dyed. But anyway, hippies, generally speaking, rejected their parents' ideals and their materialism, and they decided to strike out on their own and create their own peaceful, loving society. And it sounds like a really cool idea. And for a while, it was pretty amazing. It sort of was a grassroots effort. It happened because word of mouth, and hippies would talk to one another. They would kind of all come together in various places and meet up, and they would sing songs, and they would play guitars and bang on a tambourine. And they listened to a lot of the music of the time that really kind of helped them figure out who they were. And they were, for the most part, a very peaceful group of young people. Now, were there some bad things about hippies? Oh, yeah. One of the things about the hippie generation is defined in our culture is the drug use. You might have heard that hippies like to use illegal drugs, and many of them did. Many hippies became addicted to marijuana and to pills and to LSD. And so there's definitely a dark side to the hippie culture. But that aside, what they stood for was pretty remarkable. Here in this country, it's not the first time we've seen a counterculture rise up and kind of define a culture. And for the hippies, that was true. They defined a culture. But again, it was a real brief moment, 6 years maybe tops. Hippies would generally gather in places, and some places more than others. San Francisco was a huge, huge place where hippies would gather. They would have sit-ins and love-ins, and they would gather in New York City and all over the country, even in Portsmouth. My brother was a hippie, and he was telling me that Portsmouth was a hotbed for hippie activity. They would go to the parks and they'd sit around, and they'd smoke a lot of dope and play music and have a good time. Hippies generally weren't violent people, even in a time in the 1960s where the country was literally falling apart, literally. Hippies generally were very peaceful. They didn't want to get involved in violence. And yeah, sure, they hated the war. They couldn't stand the Vietnam War. But it was very rare to find hippies actively, violently pushing against the war. What did they do instead? They ignored the war, they burned their draft cards, and they went out and found a field, sat down, smoked some dope, and listened to music. And yeah, that's pretty simplistic. But, that's kind of what the hippies were all about. They were all about peace and love. What sort of legacy did they leave behind? Well, they left behind all kinds of things. One, a lot of hippies were vegetarians. And vegetarianism becomes kind of an accepted practice in the United States, and a lot of people are vegetarians today. The hippies kind of made that popular. Another thing that the hippies left behind was a love for the earth and working with the earth. And so environmentalism really kind of is a hippie thing as well. They help institutionalize the idea of living simply and working sustainably within the earth. And so, we can thank the hippies for that. The hippies were all about kind of helping each other. And they came from all over the country, every cross-section of Americans, white Americans, African Americans. Everybody could be a hippie if they were young enough. And they didn't really trust most of the older generation. They looked at anybody over 30. In fact, they had buttons that said, don't trust anybody over 30. So they didn't really trust the adults. But that went both ways because the adults didn't trust the hippies. You know, the hippies, especially to an older American, they said, "Oh my God, what are we doing? You know, why this generation's going to take over this country? Good grief!" And so they were rightfully scared about leaving the country in the hands of the hippies. You know, where are hippies today? Well, they're in their late 60s and early 70s. And a lot of them still believe in the things that they believed in when they were hippies. They brought some of the mindset, the love of the earth and sustainability, and they brought that right along with them. And they've raised their own families that way as well. And sure, you can still find a few hippies laying around here and there, but pretty much the hippie movement has come and it's gone. The last great hippie gathering was in 1969 in upstate New York for a music festival called the Woodstock Music Festival, and it lasted for 3 days, and there were hundreds of thousands of people that went, and it was an epic time. The 50th anniversary was last year, as a matter of fact. And so, you know, right after Woodstock, the hippies didn't know it then, but that was pretty much the last big gathering of hippies. After Woodstock, things kind of peter out. The hippies grow up a little bit more. A lot of hippies decide, it's time to join society again. It's time to get married. It's time to raise a family. It's time to go back to school. A lot of them dropped out of college, and that made their parents really angry. A lot of hippies went back to school. They got their jobs. And as time moved on, as quickly as it began, it ended just like that. It just kind of blew away. And by the early 1970s, you can hardly find a hippie. But today, like I said, that the hippie culture is still kind of around, and you can still see elements of it kind of hanging around. So as we study a little bit more about the counterculture and about hippies, I hope you come to appreciate a little bit. You may look at them and say, they're just a bunch of bums. But you might come to appreciate some of the things that they actually stood for. And it's a pretty interesting time. Even though it's a teeny tiny amount of American history, it's a pretty fascinating thing to look at. And so as we start to kind of understand a little bit more about the counterculture and the hippie generation, I hope you understand and hope you enjoy this. So, all right, well, peace, and thanks for joining me, and we'll see you soon.